3, 2, 0. Okay. Hello to all of you. Nice to have you here around the globe, or so I hope. Welcome to this fourth session in the series of talks we are having in the context of the chair Immanuel Wallerstein. The chair Immanuel Wallerstein is an interinstitutional academic space we're filling today, an academic space co-created and co-organized by, on the one hand, the Centro de Estudios Avanzados and the Facultad de Ciencias Sociales of the National University of Córdoba in Argentina, and on the other hand, the Institute for Social Research here in Frankfurt, Germany. I'm Stefan Lessenich. I'm the director of the Institute for Social Research, and I'm very happy to welcome here, to give a warm welcome today, mediated by digital technologies, but nevertheless, very warm welcome to Gurminder Bhambra, who is our guest today in this fourth session. Welcome, Gurminder.
Thank you so much for this. Let me just share my screen. And
yes.
then
you can already share your screen, but I will be shortly introducing you to the audience, and we now already see the title of your presentation. Short introduction. Gurminder Bhambra is professor of historical sociology in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Sussex in United Kingdom. She is one of the most important protagonists of a global historical sociology, a field in which she has published not only widely, but she has published really seminal and path-breaking books. The first having been Rethinking Modernity, Post-Colonialism, and the Sociological Imagination, published back in 2007 with Palgrave, and if I got it right, republished in 2023 with a new preface entitled From Rethinking Modernity to Reparatory Sociology. And her latest book, her latest monograph at least, is Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, published with Polity in 2021 and written together with John Holmwood. In between, there have been plenty of papers and several co-edited volumes, of which I want to highlight two. On the one hand, Imperial Inequalities, the Politics of Economic Governance Across European Empires, edited together with Julia McClure, with Manchester University Press in 2022, a volume that already points to the theme of Gurminder's talk today. And on the other hand, she is a co-editor of the Sage Handbook of Global Sociology, published with, obviously, Sage last year in 2024. Gurminder has held visiting positions around the world, among others in Paris, in Princeton, Brasilia, Linköping, and Växjö. And only recently, she completed a 3 years, I guess, research fellowship project funded by the Libre Trust on varieties of colonialism, varieties of empire, which is the larger context of her presentation today. So her talk is entitled, you can see that already on the first slide. Her talk is entitled Varieties of Empire, Extraction, Incorporation, and the Political Economy of Colonial Rule. And thanks again, Gurminder. We're very happy to have you here, and now we are looking forward to your presentation. Afterwards, there will be a short comment made by me with some questions to Gurminder, and then we'll have enough time for a discussion with the audience for some 20 or 30 minutes. Okay, Gurminder, it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Stefan. That's a lovely introduction, and it's really wonderful to be here with you all today. So as you mentioned, the talk that I'm going to be presenting emerges from this recent research project that I've been undertaking on varieties of colonialism, varieties of empire. And what the broader project seeks to do is really to rethink the standard understandings of or the standard conceptualizations of empires and nations, which tend to be understood within the social sciences, at least, as two distinct types of political organization. The former, empires, are primarily associated with the pre-modern world, while the latter, nations, come to be seen as the political forms that are paradigmatic of the modern world. However, the neat story of empires gradually coming to be replaced by nation states is really not clear-cut. For example, the exemplar nation states of modernity, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, that come to be established simultaneously with the development of overseas empires. So these empires don't emerge in the process of these nations do not emerge in the process of replacing empires, but rather through the creation of overseas colonial empires. And these overseas empires, as I'll go on to suggest in the talk, need to be understood as distinct from pre-modern empires with which they are often otherwise aligned. Now, the task of the larger project is to distinguish between types of empire, what I call empires of incorporation and empires of extraction. And I will go on to suggest that this distinction matters because empires are not simply, or that the differences between empires are not simply of form, but substantive. That is, that those differences have political consequences that we need to reckon with. So what I want to do in the talk today is really ask what we can learn about the varieties of empires by examining the ways in which famine came to be addressed during the period of British colonial rule in India, and contrasting that with the practices of the earlier Mughal Empire. And one key difference in the way in which famine is approached, I will suggest, is that under the logic of incorporation, foodstuffs are moved within empire from areas of surplus to areas of deprivation, whereas under the logic of extraction, they are moved from areas of deprivation to the geographically distant metropole. And in the talk, I move from the different treatment of famine to construct a sociological understanding of the distinctiveness of modern European empire. I'll start, however, with the discussion of the broader project, which is defined in terms of an apparent paradox. And the paradox is this, that the nation state is the primary political unit of analysis across much of current social science, particularly within political science and sociology. And its emergence is associated with modernity, the making of the modern world. And the rise of modernity is argued to involve a corresponding decline of empire as a political form. So there's general agreement that a new political landscape of nation states is usually argued to have emerged with the system of sovereign states that came into being in Europe following the Treaty of Westphalia. This is seen to begin a process of the disruption and decline of old empires within Europe. And it places the political form of empire as part of a pre-modern past, albeit continuing into the modern period. At the same time, however, and in apparent contradiction of this account, there is seen to be an expansion of European empires beyond Europe. This expansion is in turn integral to the rise of nation states that are otherwise understood to be central to modernity. So the point is that the period in which the British, French, and Dutch nation states were becoming consolidated is the same period in which they were establishing overseas empires. And whereas the standard presentation within the social sciences sees them as being nation states having empires, a more appropriate understanding is to see them as these new nation states as being colonial states. That is, as being empires organized under the core idea of a national project of conquest. It's the fact that modern empire is established at a distance, that is overseas, that enables claims of the predominance of and the integrity of an essential nation that underpins the legitimacy of political rule domestically, while there is a purported right to colonize globally. And it's this which enables the political form of empire to be displaced from understandings of modernity, which are otherwise centered on the idea of the emergence of the nation state form within Europe. And I might also add, these are associated with the form of the emergence of a capitalist market economy. Now, in what follows, I will propose that colonialism is central to modernity, both politically and economically. While empires have been argued to be the default mode of political organization across the world throughout most of human history, I would suggest that it's specifically a new form of colonialism that over the last 500 years has brought into being the world that we understand as modern. The fact that colonial processes are not systematically theorized as central to histories of modernity is something that I have discussed at much length elsewhere. What I want to highlight here is the continuity of the political form of empire across the period of the emergence of the modern world, and to point to the specificity of colonialism as central to the claimed modernity of that world. Otherwise, in the literature, empire tends to be understood as a uniform phenomenon with similar features. However, I will set out the ways in which colonialism, central to the emergence of the modern world, is also central to the development of a distinct type of empire. So in effect, within work that I've done recently, what I've sought to do is distinguish between two types of empire, an empire of incorporation and an empire of extraction. And what I've done is to argue for the specificity of colonialism to the latter form, that is, to empires of extraction. So first, to say something about modern empires. There's been much work on empire in recent years, and Christian Kumar has been one of the key theorists. He has argued for us to think about two watershed moments in the differentiation of types of modern empire. The first is that inaugurated by the cultural transformations of the Axial Age. And the second is marked by the rise of overseas European empires. These empires, he suggests, resulted from the voyages of discovery, both in terms of the discovery, in inverted commas, of the lands that were to come to be known as the Americas, and the rounding of the Cape to consolidate trade routes to the east. His broad classification of empires, from ancient to classical to overseas, cannot, however, accommodate a number of other significant empires in world history, perhaps most notably the Aztec and Inca empires. But it also has no place for land empires within Europe, such as the Scandinavian or the Austrian Habsburgs, which come to be regarded simply as adjuncts of a monarchic absolutism. There are also other anomalies with this broad classification. Today, I'm not going to address these anomalies as such, but I do intend to take them up in the monograph that's associated with this project. What I want to make an argument for here is to think about how we can conceptualize empires differently so that these anomalies no longer exist. And I do this, first of all, by focusing on what is seen to be distinctive of the globe encircling overseas empires, as Kumar calls them, that mark the second watershed moment. One thing to take note of is that even though Kumar and other theorists of empire do talk about differences between empires, they're very careful not to overemphasize the differences between them. There's a sense that even if there are differences between types of empire, that all empires are basically the same sort of thing. And we see this also in the work of Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper, who talk about the ways in which, again, even if empires have differences between themselves, there are key similarities that are so important that they actually create the idea of empires as being the same sort of thing. And I've listed some of these issues on the PowerPoint. Things like how empires employ a politics of difference, or their use of intermediaries, or the ways in which empire is imagined and their repertoires of power. So in describing empires in all their variety, they're also keen to insist that there's something common to all of them. But what I want to talk about is actually a difference between two types of empire that I suggest is significant. So contra Kumar and contra most other scholars working on empire, I argue that simply designating a political system an empire does not imply a simple commonality of consolidating pre-existing political units within a larger one. Rather, I argue for the need to understand the specificity of colonialism to the creation of a distinct type of empire, one that I will go on to call empires of extraction. But before talking about those, I do want to talk a little about colonialism itself. And I want to set out the varieties of colonialism that intersect and coalesce over time to establish this difference between empires. So there is a generalizable European mode of colonization, as Jürgen Osterhammel has set out, that distinguishes colonialism from other processes of domination and expansion. This involves territorial acquisition, settlement and governance, and a variety of modes of domination and subjugation that are fundamental for shaping the modern world. Within this general definition, I have gone on to identify three specific processes. First, there is colonialism by corporation, a phrase I take from the scholar Areva Muden. Second, there are state practices of extraction of resources at a distance, including those associated with forced labor. And third, there is the form of emigrationist colonialism. Taken together, these three forms of colonialism are what intersect and coalesce to consolidate European political and economic global dominance. It is these processes that I argue that have brought into being the modern world and have shaped our institutions and the ways in which we understand that world. And it's also these processes that establish empires of extraction as distinct from earlier empires and then from empires of incorporation. So I employed this analytical distinction between the presentation of empire as a common political form, and I suggest that it also provides a deeper substance to Kumar's descriptive distinction between maritime and land empires. So to talk about empires of incorporation to start, I suggest that these emerge through the expansion and socioeconomic development of pre-existing political formations. They involve processes of occupation and the annexation of contiguous lands. And they are primarily a consequence of initiatives by rulers within any given territory. And it involves the development of centralized administrative and political institutions to govern a defined, if expanding, area. Incorporation may well give rise to resistance, but it was also generally inclusive in the order of rules and obligations that organize the claims to territory. So the empires I'm thinking of under the term empires of incorporation include the land empires within Europe, but also empires like the Chinese and Mughal empires. In contrast, empires of extraction, I argue, operate at a distance and are organized through the colonial processes I set out just now. And they differ from other entities called empires in three significant ways. First of all, expansion within empires of extraction involves the subjugation of populations who were subject to rule by the colonizing state, but were not part of its order of rule. That is to say that the political conditions of government were not common across the territory of the empire, and there were different legal systems in the metropole and the colonies. So if we think about France, for example, the Code Noir was established in the late 17th century, to regulate the lives of the enslaved in the French Caribbean. It also covered the conditions governing the lives of those within the French colonies more generally, and those who had migrated from the colonies to the French national state. So it codified a separation of laws and regulations across empire and was applied differently to the enslaved and colonized populations. In contrast, the Ottoman Empire, for example, did not, as Maria Todorova argues, have an institutional legal distinction between metropole and dependencies. Instead, the Ottoman Empire encompassed a system of legal regimes, secular, Islamic, other religious laws, and customary practices, which were all authorized by a central overarching power. The management of difference through a recognition of plurality and inclusivity contrasts sharply with the practices of European empires of extraction, which were organized on the basis of establishing a strict hierarchy between us and them that was codified in law. This leads on to the second difference between the two types of empires, and this is the subjugation. That subjugation was organized on the assumption of civilizational, religious, and/or racial superiority by the colonizing state. The mark of colonial difference, as Partha Chatterjee has called it, was central in defining who was understood as a national citizen or subject, and who was part of the order of rule and who was not. The third difference is that the land and resources of the colonized population were deemed to be available to the colonizing state for its own purposes without consultation, formal or informal, with the local population. This also included the populations themselves, who were captured and enslaved and coerced to labor on plantations in the Americas and the Indian Ocean world. The forms of enslavement from the African continent leading to the triangular trade were matched by modes of indenture and servitude across the Indian Ocean world as a defining characteristic of European empires of extraction. So these three key factors, I suggest, are central in distinguishing between empires of extraction and empires of incorporation. And this is what generates, or this is the substance of the analytical distinction that I'm making between them. What I want to do now is focus in particular on the Mughal and British empires in India and discuss their organization and practices in the context of their responses to food and scarcity. So I will do this through a discussion of famine. Famines have been documented throughout human history and across cultures and societies. They are exceptional events associated with acute food scarcity, often arising from unexpected weather patterns and the failure of crops. And relatedly, are also connected to the culmination of chronic conditions of scarcity and dearth associated with ongoing wars and situations of social and political instability. For the most part, they represent periodic crises as opposed to being the normal condition of things. And there is a general expectation that political authorities will respond to protect the populations for whom they are responsible from starvation and disease. Indeed, the very legitimacy of the polity is bound up with its ability to address the persistent conditions that lead to famines, as well as its response to the crises of subsistence caused by them. Amartya Sen's work has done much to extend understandings of famine beyond simple issues of food availability. As he suggests, it is the effectiveness and will of the government in intervening in the various determinants of famine that enables a distinction between famines that cause hunger and privation and those that, as Alex Deval notes, kill. One of Sen's most well-known claims is that famines have never occurred within functioning democracies and are instead associated with modes of authoritarian rule. He points in particular to the fact that the prevalence of famines in India throughout the period of British colonial rule ended abruptly with the establishment of a democracy after independence. This assumes, albeit implicitly, that famines had been a constant throughout Indian history. While it may be correct that there have never been famines in functioning democracies, democracies are not the only political entities to have effectively managed famines. And nor is democracy an unproblematic descriptor, given that for much of the period of British colonial rule in India, a period marked by the prevalence of famines, Britain considered itself a liberal democracy. During the period of British rule, the number and intensity of famines increased exponentially. In the 90 years of East India Company rule, there were 12 famines, not including periods of severe scarcity. The first 40 years of direct rule by the British state from 1860 to 1900 saw not only the incidence of famines significantly increase, but also a substantial rise in the number of deaths associated with famine. In the last 10 years of this period alone, the Indian special correspondent of The Lancet estimated that 19 million people died either as a consequence of direct starvation or of the diseases arising from starvation. This contrasts starkly with the period prior to British colonial rule, both within the Mughal Empire and other kingdoms across the subcontinent. Alexander Loveday, a British economist who worked for the League of Nations, compiled a list of famines in the history of India from the 3rd century onwards. He stated that major famines in the early modern period appeared to occur in cycles of 50 years, and that after exceptional periods of drought, a time of comparative prosperity may be expected, varying in length from 40 to 50 years. This was not the pattern of major famines within British India, which were far more regular and which established chronic poverty from which populations were not able to recover in the subsequent years. As W.H. Morland notes, the famines recounted in the chronicles of 17th century India were food famines. That is, these were times when it was not a question of obtaining the means to pay for food, but of getting food at all. Whereas the famines under British rule were work famines. That is, when the poor were unable to command food that was otherwise available. So in setting out the different organization or the different responses to famine and the different incidents of famine within the Mughal period and the British period, one of the arguments that I make is that British colonial rule was fundamentally different from the earlier period of the Mughal Empire, and that partly what created British colonial rule as distinct was its mobilization of a distinct form of colonial political economy. When the British came to India, and first they do it through the East India Company and then its direct rule afterwards, the first key difference from the earlier Mughal Empire can be seen to be the fact that the British, in effect, remain British. They don't make India their home, and their center of gravity, if you like, continues to be located in territories in the British metropole, not in India itself. So the British remain foreign. They fail to integrate into the social and cultural norms of India, and political rule, together with the formation of economic policies, come from London and were oriented to the interests of Britain, not to the interests of India. And now, given that it's the East India Company that first establishes forms of rule within India, it's easier to separate the mode of rule between Britain and India and assume that what happens in India had little connection to what was happening in the metropole. But I would argue that the mobilization of the precepts of a political economy that I'm calling a colonial political economy is what distinguishes the nature and form of colonial rule by the British in India as distinct from that under the Mughals. One key distinction is that when the East India Company win at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, within a few years, they also win the right to collect taxation. Initially, this is to collect taxation on behalf of the Mughal emperor, but by 1767, they have asserted their right to the taxation itself. So what that meant was that the people associated with the East India Company would collect taxation from the populations of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, 30 million people in total, and they would take that tax as private wealth and return the monies to, or take the monies to Britain. And so this was also done through the development of an understanding that the territory that was being governed ought to be understood as a company estate. And they developed the idea of rent, or the theory of rent, in order to get around the fact that if it was a tax, then a tax implies that a service is provided to the population in return for the tax that is taken. A rent, however, requires no such reciprocal obligation. And so they shift the terminology from tax to rent. But what was the basis of them determining rent? There was no basis beyond the fact of colonization and conquest itself. So calling land revenue rent rather than taxation is the way in which they sought to legitimize their rule in India, and also to suggest that the tax burden upon the colonial population was very light and was indeed preferable to earlier practices. But what this distinction means in practice is the fact that when there were moments of food scarcity in India under Mughal rule, those instances of food scarcity required the emperor to use the taxation monies that had been collected and saved and organize some form of either redistribution of the wealth, the setting up of food kitchens, the organization of work programs to enable the population who were suffering to have that suffering be alleviated. When instances of food scarcity happen under British rule, they don't feel that they have any obligation to address the crises because they're not conceptualizing the money they've taken as taxation and see no obligation that they have to the population. So this is not to suggest that there were no instances of food scarcity under the Mughal period. There were, but there were no periods of systematic death as a consequence of food scarcity under the Mughal period or prior to that, in the way that there was as soon as the British established their rule in India from 1757 onwards. From that period, what we see is both the increase in the number of famines, the intensification of the consequences of famine in terms of death, and this is a process that goes on even after East India Company rule and the takeover of direct rule by the British instead. One of the other things that it's important to note here is that the money that the East India Company is taking back to Britain, this coerced taxation, the British government then also lays a claim to it and requires a dividend to be paid or a tribute to be paid to the British Crown itself. And what that enables is for the government in Britain to reduce the land tax burden on the domestic elite by 25%. So the taxation of those of colonized subjects in India is not only not used to ameliorate the conditions of crisis and catastrophe when they happen, but that money is also being used to alleviate the tax burden of the elite back in Britain. So to bring the two parts of the presentation together, what I would say in conclusion really is the fact that food scarcity has been a recurrent feature of human societies, but it hasn't always led to famines that kill. And indeed, through the research that I've been doing, one of the things that has become quite clear is that famines that kill are exceptional phenomenon within most political arrangements. The one exception, however, is European overseas empires, which over time normalized and systematized the conditions of food scarcity and hunger that are the prelude to mass starvation and death. Now, whilst today I've spoken mainly about the British Empire in India, the preliminary research that I've done on the French Empire in North Africa, but also in Indochina, and the Dutch Empire in what comes to be known as Indonesia, had very similar sorts of processes whereby food scarcity was allowed to develop into famine situations that caused death in a way that they were not allowed to develop to that extent within their home locations. So Dadabhai Naoroji has argued that chronic poverty was produced through the processes of colonial drain, and it was this that was associated then with the impoverishment of the population over 2 centuries. It was this impoverishment, which was a consequence of direct colonial policy, that both exacerbated the intensity and frequency of famines, especially, as I was mentioning, colonial populations were denied any spend and mitigation from the resources collected. It's the asymmetrical relationship between the taxation of a population and an absence of representation that I suggest is one of the defining features of an overseas colonial empire, what I'm calling empires of extraction. And while the absence of political representation is also a feature of empires in the pre-modern world, they were nonetheless organized in terms of modes of moral economy that sought to regulate more or less effectively the relationship between rulers and the peasantry. The famines that occurred within such empires tended to be associated with scarcity, leading to hunger rather than to death. The famines that produced death were episodic in pre-modern empires or in empires of incorporation, and in contrast to those that were occurring within overseas colonial empires, were not systematic, and nor were they associated with the operation of state policies. In this context, famines that systematically produce death point to something distinctive about a new economic order that was being produced through colonialism. Most social science accounts, however, represent the emergent economic order as constituted by capitalist social relations, rather than those of colonialism, and specifically the development of overseas colonial empires. I want to conclude by saying that the failure to acknowledge the difference that colonialism makes is also what enables some to argue that all empires are basically the same sort of thing. In contrast, as I hope I've demonstrated here, there are significant differences between the Mughal Empire and British colonial rule in India. And these differences are common to overseas European colonial empires, that is, empires of extraction, as distinct from empires of incorporation. Thank you. And if you want to find out more, the arguments that I've presented here, there are 2 recent papers that I've noted here from which I draw many of the arguments.
Thank you so much, Gurminder, for this impressive talk. Thank you very much. And yes, I would have pointed to the 2 publications as well. And in the short command I'm adding now to this presentation, and which will lead me to 2 or 3 questions I will be posing to Gurminder, I will partly refer to the publication in the European Journal of Sociology that you listed in the last slide. So let me shortly comment. Thank you very much. I would place your talk in the context of your work of the last years, and I would say that for at least 2 decades now, you have been pursuing an intellectual, academic, and for that matter, I would say political project, which is really of the utmost importance. And that is because at the center of your work is the observation of the, I would say, co-constitution of colonialism and modernity, or modernity and colonialism. So they are really co-constitutive and intrinsically related to each other historically and in their logics of operation. It is the process of European overseas colonization and the structures of coloniality established in that process that have brought into being the modern world and that have shaped our social structures and social relations, our institutions, our mode of social reproduction, and our understandings of the world. Our means in the global north, but most probably also in the global south. In this context, Gurminder's recent work she has been presenting today is devoted to demonstrate the modernity of empires. Not only is there a continuation of empires well into modernity, but modernity itself is marked by the rise of a specific form of empire, the colonial empire, the European overseas empire, and as you frame it, the empire organized as an empire of extraction. It is modern Western nation states as colonial states that establish and organize empires under the idea of a national project of conquest and expansion. Empires rooted in and reproduced by a specific political economy of colonialism. A system, this political economy of colonialism consists, to say the least, of a system of domination by denying citizenship to the colonized populations, a logic of legitimation of colonial rule by the idea of civilizational superiority, and a system or logic of extraction of the resources from the colonies for the primary use in the metropoles. This political economy of colonialism, in a sense, is still in place today, still yielding revenues for the political economy of the metropoles or center, and still implying a major impediment for economic and social reproduction in the former colonial periphery. So this, to me, is a really compelling analysis, also compelling the analysis, put down to the example of famine regulation in India under British rule. And it induces me to 3 questions I would like to ask, maybe pulling the argument somewhat further. So first question, is that you illustrated your general thesis by reconstructing the political economy of famine production and management, if you want to, or regulation in India under British colonial rule. And only in passing in the journal article you published on the topic in the European Journal of Sociology, only in passing you claim that your analysis holds as well for Dutch and French colonial rule across the 19th and 20th century. Your focus on commonalities of extractivist empires or empires of extraction, British, Dutch, French. And I would ask you if you could say somewhat more about their internal differences. So you mark the differences between empires of extraction vis-a-vis empires of incorporation, but what are the internal differences within this realm of empires of extraction? And in the article, you seem to be critical about André Gunda-Frank's differentiation between progressive and regressive colonialism, so bourgeois colonialism of the British type and feudal repressive colonialism of the Portuguese or Spanish type. So, but then where would you see differentiations within this type, if it's not the more progressive or more regressive type of colonialism, and then of empires of extraction? And in how far do issues of timing and sequencing matter? So who comes first in the establishment and organization of empires and extraction historically, and who's a latecomer? And at which time are these empires of extraction established in the first place? That would be the first question. So internal differentiation within the category of empires of extraction. The second is that in your example about the regulation of famine in India under British colonial rule, you center your analysis of extraction on the politics of taxation. So the question of rent versus taxes, and the constellation of a de facto taxation without representation. And I would be interested in knowing what you think the relation is between the politics of taxation and other dimensions of empires of extraction. So extractivism with relation to natural resources, or extractivism in relation to human resources, so labor power, on the other hand. So which relation you see in the Indian case between this policy of taxation and other dimensions of extractivist empires? And the third question, maybe you could decide on that actually, and obviously maybe we postpone this to the end of our debate today, because I would like to ask if empire and empires of extraction is a concept for historical sociology only, or if it is a concept for contemporary sociology as well. So you used it as a concept for historical sociology, but I would wonder if there is or what is the contemporary relevance to this concept and the reality of empires of extraction, beyond the obvious issue of the political and economic and social and ecological legacies of historical experiences of empires of extraction. So are there empires of extraction still today, or is there only extractivist colonialism? So is China organizing extractivist colonialism or an empire of extraction? Could we meaningfully talk of the subsistence of an European type of empire of extraction, or only of post-colonial extractivism? So that would be a question that, well, is far-reaching in a sense, and pulls the debate to current political and economic configurations. And maybe we discuss that at the end of this session, but if you like to, also earlier. So thank you very much again.
Oh, thank you so much, Stefan. Those are great comments, and I really appreciate you taking the time both to read the work and also to engage with what I presented. I mean, I think the first thing I have to state is that this is a relatively new project for me. I had this Leverhulme research fellowship for 2 years, which enabled me to begin thinking about this. And this project around varieties of colonialism, varieties of empire, has come only out of this work that I've been doing most recently. And so the paper in the European Journal of Sociology was one of the first substantive pieces to come out of this. And that is leading me to think about what else I need to do for the monograph that will eventually be associated with the project. And obviously there, setting out more clearly the ways in which what I am claiming at present are the similarities between the French, Dutch, and British forms of colonialism, such that they generate a common type that we might call empires of extraction, has been established. the work has been primarily on the British Empire. And so I need to do more work on the French and the Dutch to really substantiate those claims and to be able to then think about the differences between those empires. I think one of the things, because in a sense, if I step back for a moment, where I started from was a sense that the key distinction within the social sciences is between empires and nations. But within the empires that I was looking at and beginning to read about and so on, it wasn't clear to me that all empires were the same type of empire, that there was a fundamental distinction between these two types of empire, which was being elided within the general literature. And what I wanted to do as a first step was really this aspect of clarifying what the difference is likely to be between the empire, what I'm calling empires of incorporation and empires of extraction. So at this point, I couldn't say how the French, the Dutch, and the British were different between themselves. I think obviously there will be differences and those need to be thought about. But there were enough commonalities that I had discovered within the literature to suggest that they constituted a type as distinct from other types. The other issue that comes up when thinking about this thing in terms of types is that there will also then be hybrid types. So one of the things that is also emerging through the reading and the research that I'm doing is this distinction between, on the one hand, empires of incorporation, on the other side, empires of extraction. But then if we look at both Germany in the 1930s and Japan across that same sort of period, we could see the German and Japanese empires as hybrid forms that operate extractive policies in the context of incorporating territories. So they're not empires that are overseas, their empires are contiguous, but they operate a mode of extraction, particularly on populations that are seen to be different, whether it's the Slavs, the Jews, the Poles within the German context, or then with Japan, the Koreans, the Chinese, and others that are regarded as different. And so I think that there will, as I apologize, there is work happening in the university just outside. So if there's some drilling, I'm really sorry, but that's what that is. So there's this hybrid type that also needs to be taken into account. Shall I leave it there for the moment?
Yes, yeah, thank you. If you could say, I don't know if you're telling us that you're starting with the comparison of different types of extractivist empires, but if you could say a guess about the question of timing and sequencing, that would be interesting for me as a historical sociologist. And I would like to say that obviously we have the opportunity for the audience and the public to tell their questions as well. You can use the chat in the YouTube channel and please ask questions to Gurminder as well. The whole public is invited to join our debate. So yeah, if you can say something about questions of timing sequencing, I would be happy, but you can refrain from that and skip to the second question if you like.
No, I think that's a really important question because in a sense, there is an aspect. So the other gap that I've discovered in my reading when sort of thinking about this is to think about the way in which the Portuguese and Spanish empires, for example, which are the ones that James Mahoney and others talk about in the Latin American context as operating different types of empires from the British or North European that come in later. And, that aspect of between the regressive and the progressive forms that are established. That's a really important thing to think about. And I think that where I think the distinction is that the Portuguese and Spanish empires, as far as I understand from my reading thus far, were primarily about the extraction of resources, where the resources were material resources. And whilst that has a consequence for the communities from where those resources are being taken, I think the development of appropriating taxation as profit is probably the innovation, if you like, that distinguishes Western European nation empires from the Iberian nation empires, and that's something that they don't really take on in quite the same way as the earlier ones, although I would need to do more research to substantiate that claim. That's just an intuition at the moment. What's clear is that the French and the Dutch explicitly establish modes of taxation upon their colonial populations, and they take that taxation back to the metropole in order to establish public institutions, social welfare, reform, and so on within the metropole. So that the Dutch train system, for example, was funded by taxes from Indonesia. We often think about, at least in the British context, people talk about the benefits of colonialism as the British brought trains to India. But actually in the Dutch context, it's quite explicit that Indonesian taxes paid for the development of the train systems within the Netherlands. So these are, and I think these things begin to build on each other, because obviously nation empires learn from each other as well and begin to develop common modes of being. The French, as far as I have looked at it, that the key aspects are from the late 19th century into the 20th century, whereas the British are doing this from the mid 18th century onwards, and so that issue is, it does require more work, but those are just my initial thoughts on it.
Thank you. The second question was more into the example you presented us, the case of famine production and regulation in colonial India. So yeah, and I asked for the relation. You said something about now generally about the relation to extractivism of material resources and of labor power. So if you could elaborate a little on the relation between these different dimensions of extractivism. Yeah.
And I think the extractivism happens in different ways as well, because obviously there's the extraction of actual material resources. So think about the silver mines in Potosi, for example, and the actual, the brutal and brute just removal of resources from one part of the world in order to fund economic models in another part of the world. But there's also another way in which you have the extraction of resources, and that's to not allow populations locally to grow subsistence crops and require them to grow cash crops, where the cash crops are then extracted and again enter different sort of modes of circulation. So you can think about the ways in which the British initially start with opium across as the cash crop, which they then use to trade problematically with China and bring the money back in different sorts of ways. So there's, and this is partly why, if I can sort of lead into a little bit the final question in relation to thinking about this, is that these are not discrete processes. I think what I'm trying to argue and to get across is the extent to which colonial political economy, through its various forms, developments, etc., has established the world that today we understand as capitalist, but I would want to argue is more defined by these processes, which involve things like the appropriation of land, the dispossession of labor, the appropriation of laborers, the transformation of subsistence economies to cash crop economies, the mobilization of force as the basis of which to trade, not that trade is simple exchange and barter, but you're using, you're selling inferior goods at the point of a gun, which is what the British cotton industry ends up doing, and so on. And that these different aspects layer upon each other, transform each other, and in the process, the world that we today understand as capitalist in terms of issues of unfree labor and the transformations of feudalism to the modern world, ought to at least also include, if not truly consider, the transformations of the economy that happen through colonization. And so I think in terms of that, one of the key innovations, I think, is the turning of taxation into profit, and that how that because what that does is the extent of money that is then brought into the British economy and simultaneously is taken out of the Indian economy turns what were initially small differences in GDP, to put it that way, into absolutely significant ones by the time of the end of British colonial rule. You know, so India didn't have such a low account of its economy at the beginning of British colonial rule as it did at the end. And so what you see is the systematic destruction of the economy that produces that. And that's something that I think needs to be taken into account in the present, because I think it still defines how we understand that global economy in the present.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. In the meantime, I have one question in the chat. I would read it to you. I think you addressed it in your last intervention a little, but it's a question by Esteban Torres, who's the director of the Chair Immanuel Wallerstein program. So Esteban asked the following. I would like to ask Gurminder if she has paid any attention to how the active politics of India translates into the internal politics of the United Kingdom. That is, in her presentation, she describes a one-way process from empire to colony, and my question would be whether there, in that regime of global domination, is not an upward movement as well from colony to empire, which moved to the resolution of the domestic politics of the United Kingdom, and whether that movement should not be considered when talking about varieties of empire. So I think you've addressed this back coupling effects towards the metropoles, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit in concerning that specific case to the repercussions of colonial policies and politics into the metropoles and the metropolitan politics.
Yes, no, I think that's a really important question. And in part, it is the other side of the coin from what I've been talking about in the context of famine in India, because what British colonial policies produce is famine in India and feast in Britain. And what I mean by feast is the extent to which, so there's been a small project I've been doing recently on colonialism and country houses. So we have this phenomenon in Britain of country houses, stately homes. And one of the things that's quite clear to me, at least, is that when you start looking at the history of these country houses, stately homes, is the number of them that were either built or significantly renovated in the period that East India Company men are coming back with vast amounts of wealth, which is basically the coerced taxation taken as profit, and the extent to which that transforms both the very landscape of Britain in the sense of it ties into the enclosure movement that's happening. So the period where you have the majority of acts of enclosure to take land, to commodify land and remove common rights from it, is the period when East India Company wealth is coming into Britain. And so there is a way in which the wealth of Britain, in its very visible manifestations, such as these country houses, is also directly related to the very processes that are producing famine in India. And so I think when, in terms of thinking about the book, there is certainly a chapter to be written on famine and one to be written on feast, which is the connected consequence of how that money transforms the lives of the population in Britain. The other thing to note is that even though that money doesn't trickle down to the entire population in Britain, because it is captured by the elite, by the people who have access to employment and then privateering or profiteering from within the East India Company, that money is nonetheless used to stave off serious issues of food scarcity in Britain. So after 1757, which is the point at which famines really start in India, you never have a famine in Britain, because the money that's taken from India is used to at least alleviate food scarcity in Britain, even if it's not used, even if there isn't a greater trickle down of it to the general population. Of course, the one case that we have to be clear that's different is Ireland, where there is a famine. And there's precisely a famine because Ireland's relationship to Britain is a colonial relationship. But within Britain, there is no famine after 1757, whereas before that, there had been famines as regularly in Britain as there had been in India.
Yeah, interesting. I would maybe repeat a part, some part of my third question about the implications of your analysis for the sociological analysis of current times and current global constellations. So why should be interested beyond a historical interest in varieties of empires in talking about the specific political economy of empires of extraction, beyond the possible implications in terms of so-called underdevelopment in the global south. So what do you think is the sociological analytical kernel of your analysis, important for current sociological interests and debates?
So I think there's a sense that if what I'm arguing about the past has merit, then it will also have consequences for how we think about the configuration of the present. And one of the ways in which we can perhaps think about this is to think about the fact that one of the modes of colonialism, as identified by Ara Vermeulen, is colonialism by corporation. And if we look around the world in the present, I think that it's not just corporate capitalism that we're seeing, but it is actually corporate colonialism. And we misunderstand it simply as a form of neoliberalism and not as a more extensive form of the production of economic inequality, economic, social, and political inequality, I should say, that is more associated with the types of activities and processes that were brought into being by things like the East India Company, the Royal African Company, the Dutch East India Company, and others. They weren't simply commercial entities, but they sought to establish territorial rule, political sovereignty. They minted their own money. They had private armies, and so on. And I think instead of thinking about that as a phenomenon of the past, if we understood that to be part of what constitutes the forms of the colonial global economy in the present, we could locate the activities of mega corporations today much more accurately as forms of colonization than simply aberrant forms of capitalism. So I think that could be one way of thinking about this.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. I don't have any further question in the chat. So I'm wondering if some of my questions haven't been answered by you so far, but I guess you have addressed all of them. So I don't know, wait for some moment if someone from the audience takes the opportunity to join our discussion. And if not, I guess we could close earlier because we all are scarce of time, obviously. But if you have something to add to your talk, or in the light of my questions or Esteban's question in the chat, you're obviously welcome to do so.
Thank you. No, I mean, I would just say that this is obviously an ongoing project for me. And so if there are things that people have, there are things that people have thought about that perhaps they don't want to ask directly here, but they think that it might be useful for me to consider, I'd be very grateful to receive an email from colleagues
Great. Yeah.
giving some advice on that.
Yeah. Tell me if you would like to something about the plans with regard to the monograph. When do you think could that be published possibly?
Not for a while. Not for a
Okay.
while. I mean, I've got the two articles that I presented that have come out of this project, and I'm working on the next, which is around the conceptual configuration of the state. So that's the third piece that I want to do. And then I want to try and develop that through into a monograph. So over the next 2 years, I would say there's still work to be done.
Okay, great. So we're looking forward to it. And that me personally, I'm very interested in how this project progresses, and we will surely be in contact in these 2 years. So thank you very much, Gurminder. We don't have any more questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much for the opportunity to share my work. I really appreciate it.
yes, but we appreciate you having come here and giving us your time and your resources. So thanks, and we very much are looking forward to the progress of your work on empires of extraction and varieties of empires. So thank you, and thank you to all of you who have been listening to us. Looking at us, joining us, and we hope you will be here again for the 5th session of the series of talks in the context of the Immanuel Wallerstein Chair. Thanks.